Good evening and welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm Jennifer Marlin. I'm the Executive Director of the new Yale Center for Geospatial Solutions. I'd like to thank you for joining us at this remarkable moment, just days after an election that will undoubtedly shape the future in profound ways. Today, we're here not only to understand the election, but also to highlight how our campus resources and community can help us all participate in a meaningful and thoughtful dialogue about it. This event, the U.S. Election Landscape, Historical, Spatial, and Data-Driven Perspectives on Voting, emerged from a collaboration between two of Yale's new centers, the Center for Geospatial Solutions and the Data Intensive Social Science Center, or DISC, led by Ron Borzykowski. And we thought this would be a valuable opportunity to come together regardless of the outcome of the election, because we're eager to kickstart conversations with all of you on some of the most important issues of our time. So both new centers are specifically designed to help manage and make sense of the growing tsunami of data available for research. And so we partnered with the Institution for Social and Policy Studies and the Yale Library. And these resources are here to create a supportive environment for students, staff, and faculty across the university and beyond our campus to come together to have meaningful conversations and build a deeper, more empathetic understanding of our world. So today we're honored to hear from three distinguished experts on US elections. Yale historian Beverly Gage will ground us in the historical forces and narratives that have influenced US voting patterns over time. And Yale political scientist Shiro Kurawaki will explore the spatial and demographic factors that shape elections. And we also have Harvard political scientist Steve Ansola-Bear will share insights on trends in voter behavior and public opinion, adding context to how Americans engage with the democratic process. And our discussion after the presentations, we'll have a half hour of Q&A or so, and those will be guided by Alan Gerber. Alan is the Sterling Professor of Political Science, the Director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and a Professor of Economics and Data Science here at Yale. Professor Gerber, along with his colleague Don Green, pioneered modern get out the vote efforts, including right here in New Haven. And his influence on political science using experiments to test campaign efficacy is enormous, and we're grateful to him for guiding our conversation with our panel of experts. So with that, please join me in welcoming Alan Gerber.
Thanks very much. I'm going to just briefly introduce the first speaker, and then I'll introduce the other speakers in turn. And I will say thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful event to introduce you to some of the resources and methodologies that are used to analyze elections. And it's also wonderful for ISPS to have the opportunity to sponsor an event that kind of is part of the introduction of the Geospatial Center and the Data Intensive Social Science Center to the Yale social science ecosystem. The first speaker today will be Beverly Gage. Bev is the John Lewis Gaddis Professor of History here at Yale, and she specializes in 20th century US history. She has many, many accomplishments. The most, I guess, recent and is a spectacular and acclaimed biography of J. Edgar Hoover, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. This book won the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the Bancroft Prize in American History. So at this point, you're supposed to say, ooh, because that's pretty cool. Please join me in welcoming Beverly Gage.
Well, thanks, Alan, and my fellow panelists and all of you for being here. So we are about a week out now, and I think every time I come to a gathering, as the days shift, the vibe is a little bit different. What people are thinking about and what people are feeling is a little bit different. I remember in 2016, I had agreed to do a panel like this one, sponsored by the History Department, but it was for the day after the election, and found myself in 2016 a little bit unprepared for what had happened in that moment. So I think one thing to say about this moment is that maybe for better, maybe for worse, I do think that people all over American politics are a little bit more prepared. But whether that means that we know what is ahead is something of a different question. So a couple of months ago, I was having drinks with Jen Marlin here, and she said, you know, I have this new geospatial center, and I really want to do something related to the election. Like, how do we imagine the election? And I said, well, you should get someone to talk about the red-blue map, right? Because the red-blue map has just permeated everything. It's how people imagine our politics now, and I think it's pernicious. I think it's terrible. And she said, oh, well, do you know anyone who might want to come talk about that? So here I am, but I'm not actually much of a visuals person, but I do want to start off with a little bit of a rant about, I think, the two ways of visualizing our politics that are not what political scientists do, but I think really dominate a lot of the way that we imagine our politics and imagine our nation. The first of those is the political spectrum, right? And this is something we talk about all the time in American politics. You have a left and a right. This is where the ideas of a left and a right come from. They have historical origins, a couple of centuries old, but this is a constant imaginative reference point, whether people are thinking in visual terms or not. Left, right, conservative, liberal, and trying to place ourselves, our representatives, our president somewhere along this spectrum. The other, oh, wait, we're supposed to have a, all right, well, we were supposed to have a map of today. So the other is the red-blue map, which I won't put up there, I guess, but which I'm sure all of you have been thinking about. And the red-blue map, I think, has been problematic for a variety of reasons. And the first is that it doesn't tend to capture actually how complicated and close and often contested our elections are, even in this moment. So if you think about the map that we have all seen many, many times over the past week or so, you have blue coasts, and then you have this sea of red in the middle. And I think visually, that map doesn't do a very good job of describing what's actually happened, which is that we are in a paradoxical situation at the moment in which we have, on the one hand, what by any historical measure would be described as a close election. And then at the same time, we also have something of a reorientation of how we might be thinking about the questions that are up here, a sense that we are in the midst of an ideological realignment. And I think one of the big questions of this moment for people who are trying to think about the election is, how can these two things go together? How can we have an election that is at once quite close, quite contingent, an election in which all sorts of strange things happened, right? Historians like to talk about contingency and continuity. I think we have something of a story of continuity here, but we had so many things occur that we haven't seen before, and that it seems could have swung the election one way or another. And at the same time, there's a sense that something really profound and really important and potentially quite permanent, or at least as permanent as anything in history ever is, may have happened this time around. So I just want to talk a little bit about each of those. First, about the idea that we have a close election, and then about the idea that it is nonetheless something of an ideological reorientation or realignment. And I think I'll move away from our maps in a moment, but I think one of the flaws of a political spectrum is that it can't capture very well all of the mixing and matching that's going on in our moment. And the flaw of a red-blue map is that it doesn't actually capture closeness. It doesn't capture division within many of our communities, in fact, including right here in Connecticut, though it is a quote unquote blue state, is a state where almost half of the people in the state voted for Donald Trump and just over half voted for Kamala Harris. To underscore just how, in fact, close this election was, I want to show you those maps that came up before, which are maps of some of the great landslides of the 20th century. The first one is this map in 1936. This was Franklin Roosevelt's second term in the height of the New Deal realignment, one of these kind of great shifts in American politics and party politics in particular in the 20th century. Two others. This is the 1972 election in which Richard Nixon was elected to his second term. Again, you can see a landslide of the sort that we simply don't have anymore in American politics and that are almost difficult to imagine. I don't know if any of you are from Massachusetts. I know we have one panelist who has come down from Massachusetts, but this is the source of the famous slogan, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts," the only state in the union that did not vote for Richard Nixon. And one more, this is 1984. This is Ronald Reagan's second term. Again, a map that is pretty much all one color. And so while I've said that I don't think these maps are particularly good at describing where we are right now, I think they do highlight some of the differences between the era that we've been living in and some of the history of the 20th century, which is what I really specialize in. All of which is to say, for most of our conscious lifetimes, the conscious lifetimes of people in this room, we have been kind of stuck in an era of high partisanship and close elections. It is not actually typical of most of what happened over the course of the 20th century. There were some close elections then too, but you tended to have much more decisive elections and much more dramatic majorities, sometimes in the Senate, but often in the House. And so I think actually to think about our moment in a variety of ways, one of which is this period of high partisanship and kind of stuck close elections, it's useful to go back to the late 19th century, which is really the last moment that we saw this in a sustained way. And I've started to think more and more that the late 19th century is really our best point of reference in a number of ways. In terms of immigration and mass immigration, we are now at percentages that look quite a lot like what they looked like in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, sort of the peak of European immigration. Of course, the people who are coming are very, very different, coming from different parts of the world, but nonetheless, percentage-wise, we look quite a lot like what this country looked like 100 years ago. And I think looking to the kind of nativist and anti-immigrant politics of that era can teach us a lot of things. That was an era of ferocious partisanship in which questions about the civil service and whether there were going to be deep divides between people who worked in the administrative state, worked in the government separate from politics. You know, were we going to live in a country of a patronage system in which all of those jobs basically are handed out politically? Federal government was much smaller then. Or are we going to live in the world that I think really did get created in the 20th century, which is a world of a kind of independent, professional, nonpartisan administrative state, right? All of that is under stress at this moment in a way that I think we haven't seen in about 100 years. And then finally, thinking about labor and kind of the American working class and where that figures in politics. I think one of the kind of outstanding facts of the last 30 to 50 years in the United States has been the decline of the organized labor movement, such that now we have about the same percentage of private sector workers in organized unions as you had 100 years ago, right? Big expansion in the middle of the 20th century, but a big collapse toward its end. And so I think as we ask all sorts of questions about the changing class politics of the United States, it's important to keep these kind of broad historic trends in mind. All of which is to say, for a while I was thinking, the great point of comparison for all of this is thinking about the politics of the 60s and 70s, but I have been moving further and further back in time and really thinking much more about the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, periods of high immigration, growing economic inequality, real debates about the fundamental nature of government, particularly around questions of patronage, civil service, and some of the other things I've mentioned. So the last point that I wanted to offer is one about realignment and this puzzle about whether or not you can look at a really close election, right? Essentially a kind of 51-49 election at the presidential level, an election in which, as we have grown so used to seeing, right, the House and the Senate are both these kind of squeaker balances of power. How can you look at something like that and say something really big is shifting? And for that, I think the most important thing is what's happening in the Republican Party and the constellation of ideas that we are seeing come together there under a figure like Trump, which have not been joined together either in this kind of imagined political spectrum as we've been laying it out for the last several decades, or in our recent party history. And so last thing I'll say is that I think the most important thing that is happening in terms of party politics is that we now seem to have a party that is at once socially conservative and economically populist, protectionist in a variety of ways. I think that is not a combination that we have seen in a long time in the United States. Again, I think to find a lot of this, we're going to have to go back to much earlier periods of American history to think about it. But it does seem like a pretty powerful and lasting combination, and one that I don't think is going to be undone very quickly. And I think the big question of our moment is really what's going to happen on the other side. How is the Democratic Party going to refigure itself? Historians like to think in terms sometimes of changes of order or cycles of history. But if I would say the conventional wisdom is that, one grand realignment happened in the 1930s with the election of Franklin Roosevelt, the rise of the New Deal order. That perhaps came to an end in 1980 with the rise of Ronald Reagan and the reconfiguration of the politics that we all have been living with for a long time. But I don't think that either one of the parties is going to look the same henceforth. And that makes this both a very interesting and a very perilous historical moment.
Great, thanks a lot, Bev. I was just sort of thinking about the maps that you showed on the political spectrum. Depending upon how the conversation goes, I might ask my political scientist colleagues to talk about how political scientists do sort of spatial modeling of sort of the issue space, because we've advanced, we have 2 dimensions typically, not just one. No, not at all. But and then the other thing that struck me was the red-blue map, which Ed Tufte, who was a member of the political science department and a pioneer in visual display of quantitative information, he would not stop complaining about the the lack of information density in the red-blue map. You almost can't put together a graphic with less information than the red-blue map. Our second speaker is Steve Ansolabeher. Professor Ansolabeher is the Frank G. Thompson Professor of Government at Harvard. Professor Ansolabeher is renowned for his research on public opinion, elections, and the role of the media. He is the author of many great studies. I would also take a minute to just note that in addition to the individual works of scholarship that that Steve is acknowledged for, he also is a person who provides public goods. He was the pioneer of a survey called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which was a consortium which brought together a lot of universities to conduct a joint study with the feature that there was a common content on the survey in addition to each group's individual content. By pooling the resources of a lot of universities together, the size of the study could be much, much larger than the sort of study that any individual university could do on its own. And that it was a tremendous amount of work, and Steve pioneered that and continues to be involved with that study to this day. So, it's great when you do things that are individual projects that are contributions. It's also great when you can do things that provide the infrastructure for others to also accomplish a lot. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Ansolabeher.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about something completely different, which is where I sit and how I process every election, have since 2006. I work as an analyst for the CBS election night decision desk, so we actually call the elections. And I'm going to start by putting a challenge out there, which the red-blue map is a perfect introduction to, which is we don't really know how to visualize the elections very well. In particular, we don't know how to visualize what we know of the elections, and I'll tell you what we know. And the challenge is for you all, if you can, to come up with better visualizations, because they won't be on the air. So the real question is, what map or what visualization would you construct to display the election in real time as it's unfolding on election night or over a course of a week? And it really depends on what problem you're trying to answer or what question you're trying to answer in doing that visualization. So what you visualize is a function of what you're trying to communicate. So on election night, we're trying to visualize or communicate to the audience what's happening and why. And you might come up with many reasons for wanting to know that, but I think the main reason is that's how we psychologically, emotionally process our elections, by knowing what's going on. Alan asked for questions from us in advance, and the one question that I've been asked repeatedly over the last 3 months is who's going to win the election? And I'm very thankful that I will not be asked that question tonight. But that's because every person in advance of the election is trying to resolve the psychological or cognitive dissonance that they cannot resolve about who's going to win the election. And on election night, it's like the cathartic moment. It's not necessarily a happy moment or not necessarily a sad moment, depending on who you are. Every one of these media organizations has its own decision desk, and this is the CBS desk. You'll see 3 photos on the top, and they are kind of in an order, actually, of where we're sitting behind the screens. And if you look closely there, you'll see some green. That's the green screen where they shine, like, here's the House of Representatives, and here's who's won what seats and so forth. And at the end of the the first photo, you'll see Major Garrett, who's one of the anchors for CBS. And, he's getting ready to go up there and play with the maps and do their own visualization. And a couple of my colleagues, Emily West and Joe Williams, are also in that photo. So there's a big white table with a bunch of computers. The photo in the middle is Doug Rivers, who founded YouGov, the American branch of YouGov, so large survey firm, and his colleague Delia Bailey. They do all the survey work for CBS, and they have about half the states, and I have about half the states to call. And behind them is a gray object. That's the actual map board that CBS shows. So on the other side of that is a map that they're like playing with. Like, let's click on Philadelphia, and you see all the precincts and so forth. Everything we're doing is feeding into that map board. And they guaranteed that I would not be seen on election night because my desk is immediately behind the map board. And then the last photo is another set of colleagues, Charles Stewart, who works at MIT and runs a project called the MIT Election Data Sciences Lab. Kyle Kondik is working on the House. Kabir Khanna now works for the Decision Desk, but has a PhD from Princeton. If you look very closely, there's an elderly man. His name is Murray Edelman. Murray and Warren Matofsky created the National Exit Poll in 1976. And Warren's passed away, but Murray's still at it and quite an entertaining character. So this is our group, and we are literally mainlining data on election night. It's like, and we're trying to figure out who has won, what's happened in real time. So what's the problem? The general form of the problem we're trying to solve is who has won. We're trying to answer that question. It's like this moment where all of this morality play is coming to a head. But the specific form of the problem is a fascinating social science and data analytics problem, because it is this: the event has happened. There's no uncertainty you're trying to resolve. We're trying to figure out what that event looks like. And little bits of this picture are being revealed to us. Like, we get to see a little bit of Indiana, a little bit of North Carolina, a little bit of Virginia, a little bit of Florida. Can we tell what the rest of the country will look like at the end of the night? And that is a classic problem of real-time forecasting with incomplete, non-random data, right? We don't get to choose. We don't get to do an experiment to determine which pieces we get exposed to. Here's the question we're trying to figure out. We're trying to tell Major Garrett and others and the people who program that board that I never get to see, some in the back of it. What's the narrative? What's the story? What should they be putting up there? What information will help people think this through? So there are a bunch of analytic questions we have. What must we measure? And what we must measure are, how big is this election? How big is turnout? I must say, like, all the data visualizations, from the red-blue map to any sophisticated map you have, are terrible at mapping size. They never map turnout. They never tell you how big the election was. What color is the election? So you might think of it as red and blue, but vote share. I have a different approach to it, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's notable that it's worth pausing on this question of like what we're trying to measure, because in 2020, Fox made the wrong call. They didn't get Arizona wrong, but they made the wrong call from the perspective of the social scientist. You don't make a call that you are not sure of, and they made a call that they were not sure of. But they made the call they were not sure of because they had the size wrong. They thought the election was going to end a lot sooner than it did in the counting. And so getting these things right is essential for getting the questions of like, what's the size of the election and what's the vote share, are essential for getting the call right. Second thing we're trying to do is figure out what model works best. There are different angles on this. One standard model that we use is based on demographics. There are men, there are women, they're college educated, and so forth. That's the exit poll. And it's like, can we estimate and measure all those folks? That is, from my perspective, a terrible model. It never works. There's a better model that I will talk about, which is also the model that the British used to call their elections. Third, what level of data are best to look at? Right? So when you look at the red-blue state model, that's a map, that's a picture of states. That's a level of data analysis. You could look at counties, you could look at congressional districts, you could look at precincts, right? What level is the right level to analyze your data? And a new challenge that's really cropped up over the last 25 years and has flummoxed everyone in this business, which is how do we combine three really different data streams? And those three data streams are the votes cast on election at the polling places. That's the way elections used to be. The votes cast before election at election offices. Those are called early votes. The votes cast by mail, absentee, and mailed in. And those are three really different streams of data. The exit poll is about people leaving the polling place. That's the one stream of data. In 2000, after the 2000 election, 1 in 12 ballots were cast absentee or early. So 11 in 12 ballots were cast at election day at polling places. Today, 60% of ballots are cast before election day. Election day is no longer the election, and it hasn't been for a while. People don't know how to process that, and that's a very important part of the visualization too. You might imagine visualizing what comes first. All the election models do not have not quite caught up to that. Let me talk a little bit about then the analytics we use and what the best model is. So one set of analytics are sample surveys, the exit poll. We don't call anything off the exit poll. Exit poll is for telling a story, which groups voted which ways. It gives us a sense of the night, like what's going to happen. So we get the first tranche of data and information at 5 p.m. That's the exit poll comes in 3 waves. That's wave 1. And at 5 p.m., we knew in 2016 that Hillary was going down because the exit poll is always off by about 4 points in the Democratic direction. So we just subtract 4 or 5, and we saw it immediately. This night, it was Harris up 3 points. And so we knew immediately this is going to be a struggle for her tonight, because when we applied adjustments for biases, which we model and we sort of think through what the biases are going to be, we knew that it was going to be like a 50-50 election, but that she was not going to win the Electoral College. So we kind of had that sketch in place. We didn't know if it was that sketch was right or wrong. It's kind of remarkable that the exit poll does as well as it does, given the difficulties doing that, but it sets our expectations. On election night, what we are doing is actually processing real-time data as it comes in, as the polls close in the eastern United States, and they sweep across with the time changes and the poll closures. So we get Florida at 7 o'clock, we get Kentucky, actually we get Kentucky at 6 p.m., so forth. So we got these little bits. The analytical model that works best is remarkably simple. It is to take the last election and take those early returns and do a regression. So what I've shown you are 2 actual photographs I took of my screen on election night, because it was like, yes, it's working again. So up until 2018, really, the media were just dead set on this model, this view that it's demographics, demographics, demographics. And I am dead set on this view. It's the past, it's the past, it's the past. It's really the past plus a change, right? So we just need to measure what that change is. The first graph on the bottom shows you the House districts of the United States. And there are 2 different time frames. One is at 9:30 p.m. and the other is at midnight. Do those graphs look different or the same to you? The 2 down here. The same, nothing changed. If you look closely at it, there is a 45-degree line, and then there's another line that other line has a slope of 1.002 and an intercept of -0.38, which means that in every congressional district across the country, the Democratic vote share went down 3.8% from the 2020 Biden vote. Boom, just shifted across the board. That's the election was lost everywhere. And it was lost by that amount. It wasn't lost by 20 points. It wasn't lost by 5 points. It was lost by 3.5 points. And over the course of the night, that just stayed there. If you look closely at this graphic, it tells you what our forecast was for how many House seats the Republicans are going to win. The number was 222. That we knew that at 9:30, we knew that at midnight. That looks like about where it's going to come in. We've run this model every election since 2018, and at about 10 p.m., we're off by no more than 4 seats. Right? So these elections are super predictable. I've shown this to my behavioral economics friends like David Lapes, and they're like, what in the world? That's the most predictable thing ever. Like, we never get regressions that look like this. Like, you can't even use any AI. There's no room for wiggling, nothing. There's nothing to improve on. So because elections are super predictable if you view them through this lens. If you view them through other lenses, they become more confusing. This is re-aggregating the states for the presidency. This is about 10 p.m. on election night. What we've done is done a same regression using county data, and then we've aggregated up for the states, and you'll see Texas and Florida down there, Illinois, Massachusetts, et cetera, up here. Right in the middle, you see Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. And they're all like 3 points below the line. So at 10 o'clock, we just knew that this was over. There was no way that this election was going to swing the other way. But it's our way of processing it also. It's our way of like, this is a uniform, pretty much uniform swing everywhere. It's not this state, it's not that state, it's not this group or that group. It was happening everywhere. So one thing to think about is if that's the model that's driving the election underneath it, and it always looks like this. There's a baseline of the past, there's a change I'm measuring on that past. How do I visualize that? How can we, as the media, visualize that? The interesting thing about the red-blue map is it was not created by social scientists. It was not created by historians. It's actually a creature of the media. That red-blue map was created by the media. In fact, the choice of the colors red and blue used to be the other way around. Blues were the Republicans and reds were the Democrats, following the British model where blue is conservative and red is socialist. So they were Labor. And it got flipped in 1980. Like somebody at the media at CBS decided to change the colors because that red map was more striking on air if Reagan was winning everywhere than a blue map everywhere. So that's just things worth keeping in mind. But that is a challenge I will put out there for anybody. If anybody can come up with a good visualization, we are right now in the process trying to figure this out. And it's got 3 pieces. The visualization has 3 pieces. One is size. How big is the election? 2 is the baseline. What happened last time? Right? Or you can think of that as the level. And 3rd is the change. And it's really hard to visualize in a map levels and change at the same time. And if you add size to that, it becomes very challenging. But that's the challenge of like, what do we visualize and how do we understand elections? So to summarize, a few key insights to take away. One is election forecasting and understanding elections is a missing data problem. That's one view of it. And it's a very challenging, interesting missing data problem. If anybody's interested in missing data, it's a great problem because it's missing, we've got tons of data and it's missing in interesting ways that are challenging, don't fit into the usual clean missing data problems. And yet it's super predictable. It's super predictable. It's a great problem to work on. Second insight is very simple models work the best. The very simple model we've developed for turnout is about the stupidest model you can come up with. It is this. Take last election's percentage of all registered voters who voted. Multiply it times the number of people who are registered today, and that is an extremely good estimate of how many people are going to vote in the election. In other words, elections driven by how many people register to vote. Right? There's not much not very much change in the behavior. Everything else, when we've thrown everything else into that model, it creates a classic problem of overfitting. Classic statistical fallacy of overfitting, where you're throwing too much at the data, and therefore you make a classical error. Third insight is that forecasting elections is about levels and changes, and understanding those levels and changes is sort of not the way American political science and American political analytics work. Interestingly enough, about 15 years ago, the British switched to that model, and they get their elections called about 10 p.m. every time routinely, because they're just measuring the changes. They violate every rule of randomness, all the nice clean data rules. They're just like, why would you ever do a study that way? That's not a random sample at all, but they get it right. So they're letting the objective of the research drive the design rather than the design, the perfect design drive what research you do. Fourth, it's hard to get the level of the unit of analysis right. Let me tell you a paradox. In predicting turnout, you get better estimates if you use 435 congressional districts than you do if you use 3,200 counties. So with 10% of the data, you do better, or 10% of the N, still the same data. It's a bit of a puzzle, like why is it that counties are so bad? We visualize so much with counties, and red flag, counties are bad for visualization. They're bad for forecasting because of the heterogeneity. That also needs to be rethunk. So if you're thinking about how do you visualize this, try to get away from counties. Finally, maps express a narrative. Most maps that I see do not capture the real narrative of what's happening in elections. They don't capture this. And as a result, we, the viewers of the election results, don't get a very clear picture. We get a confusing picture of what's going on. And so I think it's better, and this is the challenge I give to all of us to part with, is to start with a model that works and then figure out how to visualize it, rather than try to start with a visualization or data tool and try to force the election into it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Insulver. I was going to say, I like the New York Times vectors, that map where they show the vote shifts, and I kind of like that, but I think it's at the county level. So after your remarks, I'm thinking maybe they should do the vectors, but maybe not at the county level. Anyway, thanks a lot, Steve. That was great also to get a sense of what's going on inside the networks. Our next speaker, our third speaker, is Shiro Kurawaki. Shiro is a professor in the Department of Political Science here and a resident fellow at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies. Professor Kurawaki's research focuses on democratic representation and how electoral behavior affects public policy. Professor Kurawaki has published work in the leading journals in political science, the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, as well as Nature and Science Advances, the sort of general interest science journals. Just want to say one other thing about Professor Kurawaki. Professor Kurawaki has done some analysis of ballot images, which it's a very interesting source of data. I'm trying to emphasize different types of data. So these are like literally pictures of ballots. So normally when you find out what happened at a precinct, you get the totals, like what happened in the first race, what percent voted for candidate A versus candidate B. You also will get, the other races, and you'd have to make all sorts of inferences about what the individual ballots look like in terms of the patterns and correlations across votes for different offices. But Shiro and a small number of other scholars have gotten access to and analyzed actual individual ballots, so you can see the voting patterns directly. In addition to analyzing that data, Shiro has been given a grant to make that data public so that other researchers can look at it and he's preparing the metadata to allow that resource to be available to the broader research community. So again, it's always very gratifying to see scholars who publish their excellent work in excellent outlets, and also think about how their work can be shared in a way that allows others to do their own projects and to build upon it. With that, let me turn it over to Shira.
Thanks very much, Alan, for the very nice introduction. I'm happy to be here. I thought I would talk about a topic that I've been really interested in for the last few years. Is the mic good? And that is, in some of my work, I've been really interested in ticket splitting, or how the same person would vote for different, vote for different parties in different offices at the same time, right? So like in this election, I think we have 4 battleground states in which the winner of the presidential office is different from the winner of the Senate race. Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin, and so forth. And so when you have things like that, obviously that has large impacts on the operation of the Senate and the House. But I think those kinds of differences gives us some nuance to voter behavior, because it can tell us like what kind of Democratic candidate or what kind of Republican candidate would voters support by seeing like multiple versions of different Democratic or Republican candidates at the same time. So in these slides, I've chosen to focus on Ohio. Which was a battleground state for the Senate race that many of you probably have followed. The left map is the standard presidential vote map, red-blue map of Harris's vote relative to Trump in Ohio. She won 44% of the two-party vote this year, the Democratic two-party vote in Ohio has been declining about 1 or 2 points each cycle. And you can see the counties that are overrepresented by the graph are sparsely populated red counties. And then Kamala Harris wins more votes in these other blue counties on the coast. I've kind of labeled them with the biggest cities and also R1 universities. So big cities like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus are more blue. Also, the counties that are kind of shaded blue but don't have a huge city tend to have a larger research university, like the Ohio State and Ohio University in kind of the southeast. So, what I'm showing you here is all aggregate data, but this gets borne out in survey data as well. That in terms of the realignment that I was talking about, the Democratic Party is now kind of increasingly relying on college-educated voters. I think right now the gap in Democratic vote between college-educated voters and non-college-educated voters is about 15 points. So this is kind of standard red-blue map, but I also wanted to highlight the difference for the same election, but for a different office. So Sherrod Brown was running for his 4th re-election for the US Senate. I'm showing his vote share relative to Harris's vote share at the county level. Okay. So Sherrod Brown got 48% of the two-party vote and also lost. So that means that at least 4% of people who voted in that election split their ticket. They voted for Trump one way, and then they voted for Sherrod Brown the other way. There's definitely more than 4% because the opposite ticket splitting cancels out in the aggregate. So we don't observe that in these election results, but at least 4% are splitting their ticket. And so Sherrod Brown's running ahead of Harris by 4 points. But you can see in the shaded greens that he's doing better in different places. And roughly the places that he did better tend to be the red counties more than the blue counties. He does, and he did better in kind of the eastern side of Ohio. That's the Appalachians, and he doesn't do any much better than Kamala Harris in the kind of heavily urban counties. Sherrod Brown, many of you know, has been representing Ohio for a very long time. He was in the U.S. House before he went to the U.S. Senate. I think he's been in Ohio. He's been in elected office in Ohio for close to 50 years. Although I recently learned that he's a Yale grad. He got his undergrad at Yale, but since then he's moved to Ohio. He was born in Ohio, went to Yale, went back to Ohio, got a master's degree in Ohio University. And then at age 25 or so, he was elected to state house. And then he's been winning races, all except for one, and this one in Ohio. So he's, you know, if any kind of politician can adapt their party style or their representative style to the state they represent, it's probably Sherrod Brown. And the patterns that you see that are kind of differences in region also, I think, as far as we can tell from aggregate data, also I think makes sense. He's been more representing kind of in economic realities and demands of Ohio. So Sherrod Brown has been famously a longtime free trade skeptic. He even published a book that was about the myths of free trade when he was elected to the Senate. And those free trade deals disproportionately harm local economies that rely on manufacturing or non-college educated workers. And even in survey data in 2018, where we also see that, you know, where Sherrod Brown nets the most ticket splitting votes is among Republican-leaning voters who don't have a college degree. So what I take away from things like this is that kind of distancing from the mainstream Democratic Party is working, but this time it was not enough to hit 50% of the vote. You can also, you know, the precinct returns are still being certified and coming in, but you can also zoom into counties. So I'm going to zoom into Cuyahoga County, which is in the kind of northeast part of the state, which has Cleveland. And this is a precinct level map, again, of Sherrod Brown's vote share relative to Kamala Harris's vote share, where the dark green is Brown running ahead of Harris. And then the purple here is like Sherrod Brown actually running behind Harris. Cleveland downtown is kind of in the center of the map, and then it's kind of surrounded by suburbs. You can kind of see a clear difference between the west side and east side of Cleveland suburbs, where Brown does better, even within this particular county, at a much smaller level of granularity than the east side. For reference, this is the demographic maps of these places. So there's this kind of, so the top left is the white, non-white demographic difference at the census tract level. The downtown and the surrounding kind of shape is predominantly non-white. And then so is, and it's also predominantly non-college. However, the west side of Cleveland and east side of Cleveland is different in terms of education. So the west side is white, but predominantly non-college. That's kind of the blue map here. And then the east side is white, predominantly white, but also predominantly college. And I'm not from Ohio, but I've seen some people describe the west side of Cleveland suburbs as traditional Midwest suburbs, and the east side of Cleveland as like New Jersey. So, you know, there's school districts tend to be rated higher in the east side. Housing tends to be more affordable on the west side. And again, it's kind of, I think it's most stark with the non-college college education gap. So again, like where Sheriff Brown does, he's doing better almost everywhere, but he does best even in the suburbs, running ahead of Harris in neighborhoods that are less non-college, are more non-college. And then in the kind of more wealthier suburbs where like median income is like twice, 4 times as higher than in the West Side, he's not doing any better. He's not doing worse than Harris, but he's not doing much better in getting kind of higher income white suburban votes, and his votes kind of rely on the non-college part. So, as like the population of college graduates increases, that poses a kind of dilemma for people like Sheriff Brown who have to run statewide. Because even though his traditional base is kind of, and his policies are tended toward more manufacturing-oriented workers, there's fewer of them, and you can't get a winning coalition with those voters. So that's kind of what I had to kind of zoom in on. So just so to summarize, I guess the first is that even though like swings between time might be uniform, there are demographic differences. There's differences in levels that we can see coarsely through aggregate data or sample surveys. And those are the demographic cleavages that define party strategies. Second, there's about, depending on the election, 3 to up to 10% of the electorate that's not locked into a single party. So they can vote for different parties, even in the president and Congress race. We find that there's even more ticket splitting in state house or local partisan, local mayoral, gubernatorial races. And then third, because of that, that suggests like a way in which candidates who are not on the presidential ticket, a route for them to adapt to their district and go away from the mainstream party line to get an incumbency advantage or moderate their positions. But that moderation, it happens within limits. In this case, it was not quite enough for Sheriff Brown to kind of keep representing a state that has been shifting given the realignment. So that I'll kind of end there and should have more discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Shiro. Let's see, so we're gonna transition now to questions from our audience on site. And I think we're also, if I'm looking to the back, we're also able to get questions from Zoom, the Zoom audience as well. And so while questions are percolating through the various channels that we're gonna be using, let me just ask a quick question, and just if you don't have anything on this, I don't want to stump anybody. So Steve, you said that the one question you kept getting asked before the election was what's going to happen. And so now that the election has occurred, I think we can say, well, what did happen? Like there's different theories of elections, different classes of theories or factors that that enter into determining a presidential election outcome in the United States. There's these traditional accountability models that emphasize economic performance. There's models that look for differences on issue positions. There are models that emphasize candidate qualities, things like that. There are other models as well. Do any of the panelists want to offer any, not prediction, but not retrodiction.
Post-diction?
Explanation, post-diction, yeah, explanate. Do you have anything that you want to share? I know that a lot of this will be analyzed as we have all the survey data and things like that over the coming months, but does anybody have any initial thoughts about that?
So I think we've gotten a deluge of ad hoc explanations in the news, online, and so forth through social media. And I've just been going through and asking, okay, if that argument's right, the data ought to look a certain way. So you can do this. You can just take the exit poll in 2020, compare it to the exit poll in 2024. Super helpful at a high level for seeing what happened. Like if it was a 3.5 point shift, what group could account for that? What kind of voting behavior seemed to be consistent with it? There are some things that got a lot of play in op-eds that are just flatly wrong. For example, Harris won the same percentage of whites as Biden did. Harris won the same percentage of white men as Biden did. Harris won the same percentage of white non-college men as Biden did. All of those stories about white men explain the change cannot be true. They cannot actually explain the change. They might explain the level, but the level, Biden won with that level. So they're not explaining the outcome in some sense. They might explain some deeper alignment like you described, but it's not actually capturing why did we go from 20 to 24. The two groups that do have a big change, and when you multiply it through, it's like, yeah, that's probably what happened, are Hispanics, especially Hispanic men, 20-point shift in Hispanic men away from the Democrats. Not so much Hispanic women, but Hispanic men. And other non-whites, especially Asians. That was a surprise to me, like to see that one, but it was about a 15 to 20 point swing in that group as well. They won around 70% last time, and they were in the high 60s this time. So there's big change. I have not seen anything written about the change in Asian voting patterns. I'd be very curious if anybody in the audience has any insights on that. The things I've heard said about Hispanic men in particular, and looking at some of the crosstabs from the exit poll, is they're economic voters, and they bore the brunt of a lot of the tightness of the job market and run up in prices, and that's what they were expressing their anxiety about. So it seemed to be like a very economics-oriented election. Because there wasn't an incumbent running, the historical analogs are actually interesting. The last time this happened was 1968, where the president stepped aside. That was a super close election that the Democrats barely lost. That had, in terms of historical parallels, there's like a bunch of interesting analogs that might be worth exploring for any of the historians in the room. But when you don't have an incumbent running, typically those elections are really close, right? 1948 was super close. Unclear if you want to treat him as an incumbent, but that was his first re-election. 1960 was super close. 1968 was super close. 1976 was super close. You just go right through them. Like this election, once Biden stepped aside, was bound to be, I think, super close. I think 1988 is the exception to that pattern. So I think there's some historical analogs that, like, it's just thinking a little differently about the historical record and what we've seen that might be really enlightening.
Other thoughts, panelists?
The only thing that I would say is that a lot of the contest, you're absolutely right? What we have seen over the past, I don't know, week, is people going to their pet theories to explain exactly what happened, and saying that with great confidence and great blaming of others, without necessarily having a bunch of information. But that doesn't mean the fact that those explanations have not actually aligned with the data doesn't mean that they haven't been important, because I think particularly among the Democrats, you're seeing a kind of desperate scramble to think about not only in a kind of logistical sense what went wrong, but a pretty deep and interesting set of questions about who are we, right? Who are we if we're not the party that people want in this case, but also if we're not the party that lots of people have historically thought that the Democratic Party was, which is the party of the working class, the party of non-white voters, right? If that isn't the Democratic Party anymore, then what is the Democratic Party? And I think that those are going to matter a lot, kind of who wins those conversations. It'll have some relationship to the data, but it won't necessarily be entirely driven by it.
I would add one more
Sure,
thing,
please.
which is like, it's remarkable that this was not a train wreck for the Democrats. I think it's just like back in July 23 is like, Biden has to step aside now. He didn't. That was his moment. We got to ride on this horse. The horse didn't hold out. And then imagine taking over a multi-billion dollar corporation, which is essentially what a presidential campaign is, a multi-billion dollar corporation, and porting in the top level management with 3 months to go before the big sale date. And that sale date is everything. It's like, it's astonishing just as an organizational matter that the Harris team managed to pull this off at all without it becoming a total disaster. And there's a lot of finger pointing about Harris was a failure and so forth. Like, I see this as a kind of remarkable success that she was able to do the transition, and anybody who's worked in a big organization will understand what I'm saying, that do this transition without it just becoming a total mess. But that said, they had serious losses and now they've got to regroup and rethink. They're also at a generational moment where I think Biden was kind of the last of that generation to be around, of Democratic presidential hopefuls. And so the Democrats are at this interesting moment. The Republicans have yet to go through it.
I'm sure. Is there anything you wanted to add? Yeah, so I was just going to say, to follow up on what Bev and what Steve were saying, if you just looked at like just pick a president, one of the standard presidential vote models off the shelf, I tend to grab the Ray Ferris model because it's based not on polling but on economic fundamentals. But if you just inserted the economic conditions for the United States in 2024, having a period where the price level went up quite a lot by historical standards over the previous 4 years, and the economic growth rate in the 3 quarters prior to the election, so the per capita real GNP, it has a few other variables in it. You know, you look at that model, it predicted the election pretty much dead on, as would almost any other reasonably specified economic model. So it could be there's other things going on as well on top of that are some going in one direction, some going in another direction. These models don't have the nuance that you provided about the subgroups like Hispanic men, but the overall picture was, you know, this was going to be for the presidential vote share, a very close election, a non-incumbent candidate running for re-election. Going to be a very close election under these economic circumstances, and then given the electoral college issues, this was going to be, you know, this is pretty much what you expected without having to add a lot more. Any other thoughts? If not, questions from our colleagues here in the audience? Surely there are questions. Don't tell me you have no questions. That's okay, please.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I was curious to hear more about the ticket splitting in terms of abortion. I saw some articles about how like 2 million Americans voted in support of abortion ballots, but then voted for Trump. So I was curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, I saw, and then there were some minimum wage, ACA related referendums that went in the liberal direction. Seems like given combining it with the anti-incumbent party swing, I think that should be like the primary explanation. So if people can get policies through referendums without committing to candidates or incumbents who are kind of a bundle of policies, they can do both, I guess. And so I think that divergence there you see like indicates like there was like a strong anti-incumbent force that maybe due to these other things like prices and inflation that push against incumbent, but kept the policy preferences pretty intact.
So I thought the Democrats were putting these initiatives on there to create more support for the Democratic ticket.
Right.
And it sounds
It
like you're saying
sounds like-
it backfired because people were able to separate the abortion preference from their other political preferences. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it backfired, but I guess it didn't translate. I think part of the reasoning was that you would get turnout from among Democratic voters that way. I think the provisional estimates suggest that turnout was down like a few points, 2 or 3 percentage points. And if anything, there seemed to be more Trump voters who turned out and then didn't vote on the down ballot elections. Maybe they're new voters and maybe they're voters who are not as interested in these other offices. So maybe at turnout level, it was a wash, but in terms of persuading people to vote one way or the other in the president, probably not a large effect.
I also just want to jump in and say that I think that while technically we are talking about an election at the presidential level that did not have an incumbent, it's a slightly weird way of talking about this election, because I think actually for many people, the perception was that the frustration of the election was that there were 2 incumbents, right? I mean, so Trump is not immediately coming out of office, but had been in that office before. And then that Kamala Harris was sort of just a bit of a proxy for the Biden administration. And unlike, lots of, if there had been a primary, for instance, but even in any kind of ordinary situation, there would have been a little more breathing room between the candidate and the previous administration. And so it's, in terms of the kind of public narrative of this election, it seemed like many people were describing this as a kind of election of frustration. And I think in part for that reason, because it seemed like, haven't we done this before? Actually, at least once, maybe twice already. And we're just kind of having the same election over and over again with kind of tiny but momentous tweaks in either direction.
Yeah, no, thanks. So Steve, does CBS News or does anyone else make an adjustment to the simple turnout model that you described, changing the intercept perhaps or something based on whether or not there's one of these attractive quote unquote referenda or initiatives on the ballot, or is it pretty much like what happened last time and corrected for changes in registration, assuming that the initiative doesn't drive registration?
So the actual model we use to project also includes a little bit for competition, but
Okay.
Otherwise,
All right.
it's not more complicated. You can't get more complicated than that and you do worse.
Got it. Okay, thanks a lot. All right, further questions?
Is it? Okay, perfect. So 2 quick questions. The first one is, I know that good quality survey data will come in the next month, but for the time being, can we trust exit polls, or they are too noisy to draw any meaningful inference? And so I'm kind of curious about that. And the second one is about what you mentioned about the CBS model for turnout, and you mentioned aggregating at the state level or the county level is better than using, more granular level of aggregation. In terms of political geography, this is a bit counterintuitive because we run into sort of ecological inference issue there. And I wanted to know what's your take on that. Thank you.
So the first question is it looked like the exit poll was off by about 2 points. We don't know the final national percent yet, but it looks like it was off by 2 points. That's pretty good for the raw exit poll data. And we know what the we know what the bias is because we have overlaying precincts, so we can actually adjust. So we have places where we've done the survey and have the vote in the same geography. So we make that adjustment. So we know exactly what the adjustment is. And when we do that adjustment, we get the national number right. So I think the exit poll is pretty useful at this point for analyzing group behaviors and things like that. The second question about levels is really counterintuitive to me, but so it's that if you take the 435 congressional districts, you do better predicting once you aggregate up than you do with the 3,200 counties, right? And it has to do, it looks like it has to do with, we don't have it nailed down yet, it has to do with the fact that those congressional districts are all about the same size population, 700,000, and they're all about the same heterogeneity inside internally. But counties have wildly different populations, and the heterogeneity internally, like in LA County, is so big in the big counties that it's doing something very funky. So the errors in your forecasting model are correlated with whatever the internal heterogeneity is that's related to size in ways that you can't fix.
Great. Please.
Here's a mic.
Do you mind using the mic? Thank you so much. My question is to the historian in the panel. Your point about parallels to the late 19th century I thought that was really interesting. And I thought of a president who served non-consecutive terms, Grover Cleveland. So I was wondering if there's any lessons that maybe the Democrats can draw from that era. So if you could elaborate a little more on that.
Well, the good news about the late 19th century is that what came out of it was this thing known as the Progressive Era, which was a period of innovation, expansion of government. It's sort of the birth of the administrative state and all sorts of pieces like that. And then there were some pretty dark elements that came out of it, right? So in terms of immigration, that period then by 1924 produced immigration restriction, which may be where we are heading once again, which wouldn't be such a surprise, historically speaking. So in the 1920s, after these periods of mass immigration, particularly from Europe and then from Southern and Eastern Europe by the early years of the 20th century, there's a lot of nativism, there's a lot of concern, and then especially after World War I, when there is fear that huge numbers of wartime refugees are going to be coming into the United States from Europe. And then you've had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so there are all these worries that all these kind of radicals are going to be coming into. In any case, the United States really slammed the doors shut in 1924. And so from the period of 1924 to 1965, immigration into the United States from almost anywhere in the world was heavily restricted. It was less restricted from Northern and Western Europe than from other places. But there's very, very little immigration into the United States. And then that changes with the 1965 Immigration Act, and we've seen this new modern wave. So I think it tells us that this is a kind of a plastic moment that can go in a lot of different directions. Some of them may be more progressive, some of them may be more reactionary. I will say that one of the big differences between now and the turn of the 19th into the 20th century is that I think the narrative of the United States in that moment was that it was a nation on the rise, right? That its future was going to be better than its past, and people had different visions of what that was going to be. And one of the things that has been sort of striking about American politics in recent years is how few people seem to believe that about the United States or about their own lives anymore. I think it's one of the things that's opened up room for a figure like Trump to come in. So I think we're at a different moment in lots and lots of ways, but that to me, just in terms of basic relationships with politics, how people think about their lives, their relationship to the state, I really do think that, despite all of these parallels, that's a big difference that's at the heart of some of what's going on.
Terrific. Please.
I'd just like to say my question kind of has two parts to it. So in my home state, the Associated Press already called my Senate race. However, the incumbent has refused to concede. Now, looking at
Which state?
Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So looking at like the national polling, it seemed like it was very straightforward and you have very accurate data. Do you think that it's worth doing the recount and follow up? Do you think anything will change with that? Or do you think that projections are already pretty accurate? Thanks.
So recounts are fascinating because all sorts of things are up in the air. That it's not going to be a huge percent of the vote that could be swung. I've been involved in a few recounts, and it's really hard to change the total by more than 1,000, right? Regardless of how big the jurisdiction is, it's like really hard. So I think it's a pretty steep hill, but that said, there were a lot of issues that Pennsylvania had, especially the Philly area had, with acceptance rates of absentees. And I think the claim there is, let's push on it as hard as we can to see if there's a bin of like 30,000 absentees that we can go from unaccepted to accepted. There were some legal decisions in Pennsylvania that had unfortunate effects on large numbers of absentee votes. And I think questions, can they challenge those? Because those would be way more than enough to change the outcome.
Thank you, Steve. We have a question from a virtual attendee, and they say, in every swing state, women favored Harris and men favored Trump. Could you please talk about this gender gap?
Sure, you want to take that one?
Not quite. Well, I guess in exit polls, I think, well, so usually women are a larger share of the electorate, the potential electorate and the actual electorate. And so if women actually favored Harris, I don't think the math quite works out. Maybe men favor Trump in larger margins than women. So I think that's kind of how it kind of works out at the end. So like women are, I think, a few points more larger than men, but more divided.
The only thing I would add to that is that since the moment that women got the vote 100 years ago, around about 1920, there has been this kind of focus on mobilizing the women's vote, like that women are going to, and the big disappointment of American politics for lots of people for a long time was that actually, women were just voting for Warren Harding like everyone else, right? That there wasn't actually this gender gap. So the fact that it really does seem to be here now, I mean, the political scientists can talk to this better than I am. The fact that it really does seem to be here, that it seems to be real, and that it seems to be not big enough to elect either Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris. All of those things are kind of there and in tension with each other, but it's certainly much more of a factor than it's been historically in our moment.
There's a question there.
Yes, we have one more last
sorry.
question. Yes.
I have a question for Shira. So in the ticket split, there are these precincts where Shira Brown ran several points ahead of Harris. And obviously the cast ballot records aren't released yet, but in previous elections, is it the case that like a lot of this, that the that ticket splitting is actually just like a factor of people like ballot drop off, like people maybe in those precincts, people in the Republicans are just voting for Trump and nothing else. And so then we see that Sherrod Brown is running ahead of Kamala Harris, but it's actually just because people voted for Trump and nobody else on the ballot. And I guess this would be more of a case for the lower ballot races as well.
Right, different, yeah. Abstention differential by party, yeah. I mean, it seems like from the top line numbers in the Senate race, this year was really stark in terms of Republicans rolling off more, but we've looked at this in 2020, and like in 2020, when Trump was on the ballot, the roll off is not any different by Trump voters or Biden voters. It's about 3% in a US House race. So 3% voters don't vote in the US House race, but it's like similar by Trump Biden. So that's why maybe there's a difference in the Trump electorate this time, but it was, yeah, quite unexpected.
So I saw a question over there. Yep, there you go.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, you three have probably had a lot of better things to do the last week or so, but I have just been doom scrolling mostly, and I'm wondering, because it's sort of the end, if you could each share the worst take that you've seen on the election. So you talked a little bit about, you know, the white men story, which feels like a bad take, but I'm curious for Shira.
So two different definitions of worst take. What is the darkest take and what is the worst interpretation? Yeah, I would say the over interpretation of the non-college white men. It's like at least in the exit poll comparison, that can't explain the shift, and yet so much was being made of it the day after. And then darkest, like there's so many dark things out there. I do not share those dark things, but that's another matter.
Well, I would say that the worst takes that I've seen or most counterproductive have been all of the finger pointing ones that are like, it's your fault, you did it, you know, it was this constituency or this constituency, and you're all kind of hopeless. The United States is hopeless. You're all a bunch of this or a bunch of that. And so doesn't seem entirely true, though, you know, it has some real emotional power at times. But I think more importantly that, you know, sometimes in recent years, people have forgotten that if you want other people to be in your political coalition, the way to go about doing that is not chastising them and telling them what terrible people they are, but that you actually want to be, you know, immediately after an election, it's a tough moment to extend any sort of olive branch. But I think there is a kind of tone to coalition building that isn't working very well. And we just saw that kind of in epic fashion over the last week.
Yeah, I'd say like criticism about the Electoral College, redistricting or state apportionment has fared poorly. I think when the popular vote winner and the Electoral College winner is different are like anomalies. And I think this election kind of showed that like states and congressional districts are actually kind of more similar to each other at the aggregate level. Like that's why you see same parties winning trifectas, swings being at the popular vote level being magnified at the Electoral College level. That happens because like states and congressional districts are actually pretty similar to each other. It's not like a bimodal distribution of votes. So, yeah.
Okay, so I think we're close to the end of our time. According to the program I have, I want to introduce, I guess, Ron, are you going to make a few remarks to conclude our session? I would like just to conclude by thanking our panelists and ask, you know, to recognize our panelists for their insights and contributions to our at least the beginning of our understanding of this sort of momentous historical event.
So I have very little to do now because Alan's already done this. The first thing to do is let me thank the panelists very much for doing this and for Alan for moderating. We'd given them the charge, since this was sponsored by the library, by ISPS, and in particular by the Geospatial Center and the Data Intensive Social Science Center, that we geek out a little bit and think about the data and think about the subtleties and think about different ways and modes of analysis. And our panelists have done that for us. And at this time, thinking analytically is a very, very useful thing to do. So I thank them for sticking to their charge and for making a very interesting evening. Thanks again to Alan for moderating, and thank to all of you, both in the room and online, for joining us today. And look forward to more events on this topic and others sponsored by these two new centers here at Yale. So thank you all very, very much. Have a good night.